Please join me in welcoming Juan from Chronicle, who's going to talk to us, right? He's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges with attribution and cyber threat actors.
Cool. Hello, everybody. Thank you for showing up. I think I always get the tricky slots, so the morning after the gala dinner or right after lunch when everybody's nodding off. And this is not particularly easy because I think I have I'm not going to say the most boring papers, but definitely one of the more challenging to get through. So I appreciate all of you showing up. So on that note, I'm Juan Andrés Guerrero-Saade. I'm Chronicle Security now. I have to issue a couple of disclaimers. Like I said, the paper is extensive. By that I mean it's massive. I have to apologize to Helen, who has to do the terrible job of actually copy editing that monster. For those of you that care to read it, it covers all kinds of stuff. You know, I assure you it's very interesting, very worth your time. That said, I don't begrudge you if you don't go through it. It does mean that for this talk, I am kind of going to give a conceptual overview of what's going on in the paper. I am not going to treat any of it as extensively as I'd like to, because I would need 3 times the amount of time that I have, and I want to get to questions, and I want to kind of at least give you a nice TLDR. So it feels like I'm asking you to just believe me. I don't mean it to be that way. I just have so much to cover that I'm hoping that I can do kind of an overview. So like I said, this is the short and sweet version of it. So let's talk about APTs, everybody's favorite type of operations. There's a reason why so many of us care about APTs. There's so many APT talks, and for this particular conference that has involved so many old school malware researchers, I'm sure that you've seen sort of the trend over time and how things have changed to sort of obsess over these types of operations rather than a lot of crimeware and a lot of different more trivial seeming bits of malware. And it's because in a lot of ways the material is more rewarding. It rewards a lot of thought, a lot of deep dive, but it also garners a lot of immediate attention, which is something that gets us into trouble as well. So it also means that APT releases or information about this type of research tends to be contrived, it can be oversimplified, and more importantly, I think it's problematically static. And that's this sort of like conflict between static and dynamic is something that is going to be a theme throughout the talk and a theme throughout the paper, because if I have to kind of summarize all this into one big takeaway, it's to say that I am trying to encourage each and all of you to start to think about adversary profiling in a dynamic way. So where this all started is that there seems to be this sort of pervasive distaste with the idea of sophisticated operations, sophisticated malware, sophisticated campaigns. For those of you that kind of might scratch your heads at the thought, it doesn't actually denote any of the things you might think of as sophisticated. It's not about how cultured something is. It isn't about sort of highfalutin malware. The idea is rather to say that we want free PR. This is so amazing, so great that you should pay attention to this thing that we are looking at. Alternatively, what people tend to mean by a sophisticated operation is to kind of equate it with the sense of an act of God. And that's important because we are getting to a point where our industry is embracing the notion of cyber risk insurance and the idea that, hell, we can't defend ourselves, so somebody should just pay the bill when somebody breaks a bunch of stuff. So it means that for those doing incident response, coming out and saying, yeah, for the 6-figure check that you just cut me, I can say that this is the equivalent of an act of God and it's not your fault that you got popped. It's a kind of perverse incentive for describing operations as more sophisticated than they actually are. So sophisticated, for those of us in the industry for a bit, tends to kind of invoke this sort of eye roll notion like, oh, we hate it. However, we are kind of constricted. We complain about this all the time. I've complained about it plenty, but I end up using the term as well. And I think that kind of points to a sort of deficiency of language, that it is it has become the de facto way to describe something that we genuinely mean, which is there is something impressive about this thing. We are seeing a sort of level of resource or sophistication that is worthy of a greater amount of thought and pause. But I think that we could probably find better ways to do that. So I wanted to focus particularly on the notion of how we describe these adversaries and how we could do that better. So right now, I think part of the problem is that we draw a great deal from military analogies. That shouldn't be a surprise. A lot of threat intel researchers are coming from the IC, from the military. They've done a lot of great work inside of DoD or Department of State, and with that, you learn a great deal of sort of doctrine, but it also means that you're used to things that are more common in that military space, like a static adversary, or doctrinarian views about what the configurations of those adversaries are. There are certain types of institutions or certain types of players. It also means that you can have conventional thinking about, the thinking of the adversary and also their logistics, what they need to do in order to initiate an action, a campaign, and so on. And it also tends to imply rational incentives, which is why people are sort of so befuddled by some of the lower end or crazy or irrational actors in cyberspace. I think it says more about our expectation of rationality than it says about the irrationality of the actors that we're studying. So let's consider an alternative. Rather than complaining, I wanted to kind of put forward a different analogy that we might be able to apply as a sort of de facto methodology instead of continuing to just complain and use the same stuff everybody else has been using forever. I have to admit I've never seen CSI Cyber, but it was very fitting in a sense. It's kind of like a not quite but kinda. Really, it's a caricature of what I do want to suggest, which is the notion of criminal behavioral profiling. So we're all, especially for anybody who's really into, to use the South Park term, informative murder porn, for anybody who's really interested in this sort of true crime dramas and these notions, we have become really familiar with the idea of detective work and criminal profilers and what happens when you're dealing with sort of violent crimes and you don't know who the perpetrator is. I am in no way really qualified to describe criminal behavioral profiling in depth to you, but I can at least give you sort of a skeleton of what we might use going forward. So if you think about it, what it entails is describing unknown perpetrators, forecasting risk based on behaviors, traits, targeting, procedures, and providing an output that's meant to help investigations. So if you just, for the purposes of this conversation, if we take that as a definition of criminal behavioral profiling, I know it is not an uncontroversial science, it is not an unproblematic thing to discuss, but for the purposes of this talk, if we just focus on that as our definition, then we can say that it sounds fairly familiar to what we're already doing in threat intel. And I think that therefore it can do a lot to guide us. So the operating thesis of criminal behavioral profiling is the idea that behavior reflects personality. We don't know who the perpetrator is, but at least by observing their behaviors and how they acted in a given crime scene situation, crime spree, etc., we should be able to devise a profile with a certain level of fidelity of who that person may be. So what's the primary goal of this sort of profiling? Attributing? No, it's not. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, because right now we've gone that way of sort of being obsessed with identity or institutional attribution. Like I said, we're taking a lot from militaristic thinking, and it makes sense that people working for governments that have access to demarches and retribution would want to know who they're dealing with. But when you shift into the private sector threat intel, and the whole point of it is just to give defenders a leg up, I don't know that it necessarily makes sense or that it's even all that valuable. And we might even have a conversation about how it derails research a lot of the time to think that we know what organization or person is involved. So yeah, I'm not telling you let people get away with murder, but the idea is if we're going to model ourselves after these type of profilers, we also understand that there's a segmentation of responsibilities. It's not up to the profilers to say that's the murderer. That might be the case in television, but it isn't the case in how you segment an investigation. And I think that's really important for us to understand from the perspective of threat intel investigations. So the primary goal is actually to generate hypotheses that are used to narrow nominal pools. For those wondering what we mean by a nominal pool, it just means, a list of names. So if you think about it, if we have a database of potential perpetrators, and that database is 3 million strong, 3 million people in the city of Chicago, somebody committed a crime. The idea is that you're providing a sort of a series of hypotheses or a profile that's going to allow you to take 3 million down to 2,000 or to 200. And you say, in a sort of testable, observable way, this person has to, have a familiarity with this neighborhood and be interested in this kind of thing and maybe have this kind of psychological criminal background, et cetera. But it isn't meant to say it was so-and-so. So if we were to take that and think about what those profiles are, or those profilers are actually outputting, the idea is that the testable profile can adapt to new information. It is meant to compensate for the analyst's bias, and it also has an expectation of further incidents, which I think is really important. Because, remember where we're coming from. I'm trying to criticize this notion of sort of a static profile of who the threat actor is. And I think that's particularly problematic with a lot of our publications, where we release something with static indicators, and it's almost like we're expecting the threat actors to just be like, oh, someone published something on us, I guess it's time to give up. And it doesn't work that way. So it's important to accept that sort of dynamic notion. So what would it look like to adapt that sort of methodology to cyber threat actors in particular? I think, I wanted to suggest this as an operating thesis as a sort of analog to the thesis that we just discussed, which is to say operational behavior and tooling reflects adversary configuration and imperatives. Maybe it sounds like just a fancier way of saying exactly what the profilers were saying, but I think it's an operating thesis that we should consider to say that the tooling and what the behaviors of the operators actually reflect the kind of organization involved, the kind of resources involved, and sort of their general configuration. So instead of identifying a person or an institution, what we want is to be able to create a dynamic profile that is in a sense testable based on concrete research observations. And as I pointed to before, the notion is to try to understand the adversarial configuration. It isn't to say so-and-so is the FSB or so-and-so is the NSA, but rather, because that is an oversimplification by miles, but rather to say this is the kind of organization that goes about their campaigns in this way, has their tooling internalized, externalized, has their development, with this range of resources and so on. So, at the end of the day, even though there might be, 100 possible institutions or 1,000 possible perpetrators or nation-state operations, there's actually a much smaller set of possible configurations of organizations that can pull off nation-state attacks. So I think it's much more important to be able to approximate what that configuration is, at least from the perspective of defenders that are going to need to direct their resources. So what's the main differentiator? I think at each strata of how a nation-state campaign is organized, the main differentiator seems to be externalization versus internalization. And I think that that's a really important differentiator when we're talking about nation-states that might be, on the lower socioeconomic scale and trying to embrace cyber, or they might have very little experience versus a lot of experience, 10 years, 15 years of experience in cyber, and they might, be drawing from a military background and access to military defense contractors versus, buying $50 rats or using open source stuff. The main differentiator there almost always comes down to have they internalized this part of their ops or externalized it. So instead of just saying, hey, we think this is a nation-state group, well, are we talking about tasking that is internal or external? As in to say, do we have are we talking about, the official arm of a state organization, or are we talking about a mercenary group? And you might ask, how do we know this from the perspective of threat research? Well, are we seeing a group whose tasking is mixed? Like, are they doing the kind of operations that you might expect from someone with a singular remit, or are they doing several different types of jobs under the umbrella of a single operating group? Instead of saying well-resourced, why don't we discuss what their tool development cycle looks like? I mean, for a lot of these operations, we've seen them operate for years at a time. We've seen them evolve their malware. We've seen them actually change their coding traits for a great deal. And that actually lets you know a lot about the operational tempo and resources of an organization beyond whether they have 0 days or not. That's also to say, do we believe that the tooling is actually internalized or externalized? And I think this is going to be a little complicated with the clicker, but are we talking about the kind of stuff where we expect COTS malware, off-the-shelf malware? Are we talking about customized but really open source malware or self-managed infrastructure, the kind of stuff that tends to get a lot of these groups into trouble, where you'll register a CNC to an IP range that's owned by the government of whatever country? Or are they just using primarily hacked VPSs and the kind of low resource stuff? Or are we talking about somebody that's externalized their tooling cycle? Like they might use a mid-level commercial malware producer, like Philip was talking about Hacking Team or Gamma Group or even NSO. Or are we talking about somebody that has access to high-level commercial malware development, the kind of stuff that you might expect from defense contractors, which is tends to be the most impressive kind of malware that we see. Very high-end, customizable frameworks, and most importantly, probably very expensive frameworks, which means that you treat them in a very different way, right? Like when you're talking about burning a Hacking Team sample, yes, you are messing with somebody that you have a contract with, but they also have a contractual obligation to continue to supply you with malware that's undetectable. Whereas when you buy a framework from a defense contractor, you have a vested interest, in a sense, in keeping that massive investment safe so that you can use it for a longer period of time. Also, we tend to see sort of more automated infrastructure management with a lot of these higher-end externalized groups, and you might even be in a position to use a sort of like anonymization infrastructure that's also managed by an external company. So the idea is that you are segmenting your ops, and in the higher ends of development, you are essentially saying you are best suited to manage this part of my ops. So you do this, you do that, you do that, and then we sort of coalesce things with sort of internal tasking. Similarly, what is their O-day burn rate? Like for a long time, the idea whether somebody was sophisticated or not was, oh, they have access to 0 days. And sure, I mean, that's cool. That does put you in a certain league, at least of having a certain amount of money to spend. But what extent of O-day adoption are we talking? Are you the kind of person that gets lucky and gets 1 0 day and then it's gone and like you're done with that sort of well-resourced stance? Or are we talking about somebody like Sophisy, APT28, our team, where like Brian Bartholomew likes to say, it's an O-day pest dispenser. Like you're just going to burn through different 0 days in a month, 3 different ones. I think it says a lot about your organization and their prerogatives. So, and like I said, instead of saying sophisticated, are we talking about somebody whose ops are automated? Are they doing victim box operations in a sense that leaves no room for failure? Are they doing automated cleanup? Are they doing automated delivery in sort of a secure way? Or do they make manual mistakes? And this is actually quite important because even some of the most sophisticated actors like Dooku have been observed to make a lot of manual mistakes on keyboard, mistakes when they were handling some of their CNCs, and it tells you something about the organization, the type of operators involved. So the traits and behaviors that make up a testable profile are observable in adversary proficiencies and deficiencies. And a lot of those proficiencies and deficiencies are visible to us when we're doing our research. Some of them are quite simple. What level of proficiency do the developers have with a certain programming language? Oh, we've seen 6 months of development in C++, and then they shifted over to C, or like they've shifted over to Golang, or they've shifted over. There's evidence that we've got 2 development groups involved. One that likes to use, like with the Lamberts, one that likes to use, a certain type of C++ development. The other ones like to use an old school, like STL library style development that went out in the mid-90s. It tells you a lot about the kind of people that are involved, in a sense, and the raw information is there, but we're not necessarily coalescing that into the profile of the actors that we form. So why is a dynamic profile important? Because threat actors change, and sometimes they change drastically, and in a sense, we're inciting that change. So if we're trying to provide something that has lasting value for customers and defenders, and we're trying to provide an advantage long term, the idea of providing sort of a static profile doesn't make a lot of sense. It basically means that our research output is old by the time that it is delivered. So I talk about threat actors changing. What do I mean by that? I mean, the changes can be quite drastic in the sense of, developers and operators themselves might defect, they might retire, they might die, they might leave. They're subject to regional and geopolitical schisms. You know, what happens when you've got a nation-state team that looks to us as one unified front, but it's actually two countries, and then those countries start warring with each other? What happens to that operational capability? It's something that we've seen in the past, especially when it comes to commercial and mid-level commercial tooling providers. What happens when that code base is repackaged or resold? Similarly, Kosin and I discussed this last year at VB. Threat actors are actually breached by other threat actors. Sometimes that might result in a sort of hack and leak operation, but sometimes that's just a quiet breach. That means that somebody has access to your tooling and can therefore look like you while they're conducting operations if they so choose to. Hack and leak ops, which we've seen a great deal of, and then voluntary toolkit open sourcing is something that I'm kind of dreading, but I don't think is entirely out of the realm of possibility. To say, a group like APT28 saying, hey, we're too hot, we want to sort of damage the narrative around us, why don't you just open source Gamefish and just let everybody look like APT28 and hide our operations in the noise? There's another thing when dynamics, I'm going to start kind of rushing through some of these ideas because I do want to leave some time for questions, but when we talk about adversaries sort of starting on the low end, usually they tend to kind of prove their worth and then their resources become more abundant on a nation state scale. That doesn't only move in one direction. Sometimes they become more abundant, you can buy a hacking team and then things don't go well with the government or you didn't really turn out results and resources become scarce again. And it's quite interesting because you see somebody that might have access to a certain kind of medium sophistication tooling no longer have legitimate access to that tooling, but they still have the experience. So you start to see sort of the evolution of that threat actor as their tooling changes. And a lot of other things kind of tend to happen. So if the object of study by definition changes, if it's malleable, if it's in flux, then the output of our research must in itself also be adaptable. And I think that's quite important also for the sake of breaking this cycle of hit and run research. For anybody that's actually had to do any kind of hardcore defense of a very well-targeted network, I'm sure that our research output must feel like a sort of hit and run. Like somebody gets very interested in a threat actor that my organization is defending against. All of a sudden I have all this help, I have all this visibility, and just as quickly as it came, it's gone. Everyone's like, well, NSO is yesterday's news and we're moving on to the next thing. What happens to these defenders when what they're left with is a series of IOCs that are now obsolete, a series of YARA rules that are probably now being circumvented, a series of detections that are being circumvented, a knowledge of a code base that is evolving, I think as Philip's presentation quite cleverly put. So in order to provide sort of the best possible advantage to people with a vested interest in actually defending themselves, which are essentially the customers of threat intel production, we need to be able to provide a sort of research output that's designed to be competently continued by others. And I think that's a point at which we need to kind of figure out how to play nice with one another. Like the notion of information sharing is this sort of academic idea that it's sort of nice and flowery, but we've all proven that no threat intel research outfit is going to come out and say, yeah, I'll give you all of my visibility. It's my competitive advantage, but yes, you can have it and we can all share and sing kumbaya and like do the same research. So if that's not going to happen, then at least let's have the output be on the sort of dynamic platforms that continue to track things, be in the sort of format that allows people to say, hey, I base my conjectures on these indicators. You go forth, and if you want to continue to study this thing that I am no longer going to study, there's a sort of continuity and compatibility of output that allows people to competently continue that research. So, I want to leave some time for questions, and like I said, if you want some examples of alternative profiling of what we can do with a sort of different methodology, what I did was the same as criminal profilers might go back and visit known perpetrators of crimes and sort of interview them and try to get a different sense of why they did what they did. For me, the equivalent of that was going back to very competent research, amazing research by a lot of different people, a lot of different research groups, and to sort of try to comb through them again and say, what did we miss? What could have we put together? What was available for a profile that we just kind of didn't put together because we weren't looking at it with that mentality. So some of the examples that are going to be in the paper are sort of the schism between Red October and Cloud Atlas, what profiling we could have done of equations operational prerogatives, mostly based on a lot of their cleanup mistakes and not. Different dynamics of APT disappearance and resurgence. So APTs like Careto, Animal Farm, Dooku, Flame that, sort of were burned, disappeared, and, most of them didn't ever come back except for Dooku, where we have an example of a complete disappearance and a complete retooled resurgence, which might be the only case of an APT doing that I know of. Similarly, why the Lamberts of John Lambert fame are probably the best segmented threat actor ever. And how we all got Regin wrong, which is, I think, a big claim considering the astounding quality of research that the industry put forward on that. So if you're interested in all those things, read the paper, because I don't really have time to talk about any of them. And with that, I will be happy to use the last few minutes for questions.